an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, look at that. Here we go. We're heading into the final weekend of April 2024. Heading into the 5th month of the year. Yikes. That's going by in a bit of a blur, right? I don't know where you're living, but kind of cool and gray. Although, did have a nice day, a couple of days this week. Able to get outside and play with the boys. Yep. James and Elliot came for a visit. Kicking the ball around in the backyard. Got to tell you, though, my knees are a little sore because I did spend a good deal of time putting together the Hot Wheels monster truck track. Yeah. It was all good fun. Welcome in. It's Now and Next, the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network. I'm Dave Trafford. And we've got a few things on the burner to tell you about. Next week, I'm going to kind of have the tables turned on me rather than being on the interviewer side of things. Going to engage in a conversation with Ali Musa. He is the host of Broadcast Map. It's a podcast that he's been working on, and I've been on before. So he invited me on after seeing a post that I had published on LinkedIn last week. And it was commenting on the appearance of Mirko Bibic. He's the CEO at Bell Canada. He was up in front of the Heritage Committee in Ottawa, and of course, the MPs took every opportunity to hack away and trash and talk him and all that sort of stuff over the Bell media cuts. More than 6,000 Bell Canada cuts in the last year. And Bell Media took it on the chin, to some degree. Bell deciding to sell off nearly half of its radio properties. So that was sort of the heart of it. And the whole thing was performative, right? On both sides. But what made it clear is that finally, and I think this is a good thing, Bell admitted with the last number of layoffs back, I guess, February, they're not in the radio business. It's not a good business for them. So anyway, we're going to talk about that. I'll post the details on that as soon as it is published, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. Sort of sit back and answer the questions as opposed to be asking them. Also, this week on The Ledge, if you are an Ontario politics fan, you should be subscribing to On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast. Keith Leslie, John Wright, and I spend some time kicking around the whole idea of maybe an early election in Ontario. What? Go all Scooby on you. There is a lot of chatter around it. Are there real good reasons for it? Maybe. Anyway, we've got some thoughts on that, so if you want to weigh in, put an ear on that. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. All right. This week, here on Now and Next, we ask the question, what do you look for in a prime minister in this country here in Canada? Well, funny thing is, our friend David Coletto at Abacus Data actually has an answer for us. There we go. That was a little abrupt. All right. I'm still getting used to this new suite of music beds that we've got here. Okay. A couple of things that we've been talking about throughout the last couple of weeks. And they all seem to converge in the last 10 days or so around conversations about carbon pricing. Doesn't matter whether you're in Ottawa or Queen's Park. This whole thing on the capital gains tax in the federal budget, I think, is lit more of a dumpster fire for the Liberals than they want to admit. And on the other extreme, we have the Canada Disability Benefit. And I want to get into all of that because I think there's some real clashes around how we manage those things. But I was having lunch with a friend earlier this week, and what came up out of all the political conversation that we had was this issue around brand, political brand. And I'm always of the belief that you don't define your brand, your client defines your brand, your customer defines your brand. And that's based on expectation. What is it they expect of you? And if you can fulfill that expectation, there's your brand. And that's simplifying it, obviously. But I think that there's a real disconnect with the government in Ottawa particularly. And we might even suggest the governments across the country. Because it's no longer the Liberal Party that runs the country. It's the Trudeau Party. Now, we could say the same thing in Alberta. It's the Smith Party running the government in Alberta. It's the Ford Party running the government in Ontario. David Coletto is here from Abacus Data, and he is the CEO and co-founder. Good morning, David. How are you?
Good morning, Dave. I'm great. Good to see you.
Well, and you've been furious and flurious about all of your activity lately. The amount of material and information you've been pumping out, and we've been trying hard to find a time in the calendar to get together. So you've clearly been on top of a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. But let's just talk about this brand issue, because more increasingly, and it's not just a Liberal thing, I'm hearing people say to me, I can't find anybody in that spectrum that represents me anymore. I kind of fall either outside of it or they're nibbling around the edges, and I'm kind of standing in the middle looking around saying, where do I belong?
Yeah, and I think building off what you said about brand, I always like to think about a brand as what do people say about you when you're not in the room, in terms of how do you measure it? How do you, how do you understand it? And I suspect that Justin Trudeau right now doesn't want to hear. He won't want to hear what people likely are saying about, most people are saying about him when he's not in the room. And I think there is I think we see it in the United States, we see it in Canada increasingly, this sense that there are orphans out there, people who don't feel that there's a political party, a political movement, a narrative that connects with them, which is part of, I think, the feeling that Canadians have when we ask them, do you think the country's headed in the right direction? Only 1 in 4 do. It's the lowest that we've measured in a very long time, probably since I've started Abacus 15 years ago. But this question about a brand, I think I look at a political party as a brand, and the leader is absolutely connected to it. You cannot separate the individual leader of that party from the party brand, especially since that, as you said, in many provinces and when it comes to the federal parties, the party leader almost takes over the brand. Look at what Pierre Poilievre did when he ran for leader. It was Poilievre for prime minister, and now he's very much driving anyone's feeling about that party is strongly correlated to how they feel about the leader. But beyond that, beyond the leader, I also think attributes like relevance, like, do you have something interesting to add to the conversation right now? Do I sense that you get me and you get what I'm going through? Empathy are so important to any brand these days. And I think it's even more so the case with a political party whose job it is fundamentally to reflect the will and views of the people it represents, whether in a legislature or as an organization. And when you no longer are able to do that, you get to a point where people not just won't vote for you or won't buy, if you use voting as the equivalent of buying a product or service, but it increasingly doesn't even consider you in the mix and won't even listen to your advertising anymore or what you're saying, right? It becomes just something where people just close the door to you being at all relevant to their lives.
But this is predictable. I mean, you're the numbers guy. You watch these, you do the research. You know better than anybody that 7 to 10 years in, it doesn't matter how great your ideas are. You've been on the shelf for a long time as a government or as a party leader, whether you're in government or not. So people begin to okay, it's the same old song, it's the same old hymn book. they are in the mood for change. And that's different than liking the next guy down the bench, right? Isn't that where we are?
We're absolutely there. And it's a natural progression. I think that natural lifespan is shortening. I think people's attention span and their desire for the new, shiny, exciting thing, different thing, even doesn't have to be shiny and exciting, just needs to be different, has accelerated. And so, every successful, as I look at sort of successful political brands, we look at the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party that governed for almost 40 years in Alberta, or in Ontario where the big blue machine kind of just dominated historically. One of the things now, very different times in terms of social media and how people get information, but those parties consistently renewed themselves. They changed leaders. They reacted to the will of the public, right? And some people called them unprincipled or they're not tethered to an ideology. Others would say, look, that's exactly what I want. And I think Doug Ford is an interesting case of someone and a political party that is completely reacting to public mood, right? And there are probably progressive conservatives who say this is not a conservative party. This is not, you don't run a massive budget deficit and say you're a conservative. But Doug Ford says, I'm not a, maybe he'll say he's a conservative, but he says, I'm a man of the people. I represent the people. And so I think, long answer there, Dave, but I think the challenge facing the federal Liberals is that and I believe this, and I've written about this, as long as Justin Trudeau is the image, is the central focal point for people in thinking about what the government and what the party behind this government is doing, it's going to be very hard for them to rebuild a relationship. And we're already seeing evidence of it. Polls come out yesterday. I had a poll over the weekend that people are reacting to the budget by saying, the federal budget, okay, a lot of the stuff, not all of it, I like what they're trying to do on housing, but it hasn't moved the needle at all in how people feel about the government or the prime minister.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was a piece I read last week, I think it was written by Scott Reed, and it might have been on social media, and he was talking about Iona Campanola passing away. And when she was the president of the Liberal Party, she made the point to make sure that the party was driven separately and apart from the PMO, or the leader's office at the time. And to draw the distinction between the leader and the party, so that what was being done was for the party's purpose, not necessarily for the leader's or the PMO's purpose. And I think we've gotten way far away from that. And to some degree, that has been, I think, a detriment, where it becomes synonymous, as opposed to the Liberal Party or the Progressive Conservatives or the NDP or the Greens have a certain lane that they're in. And the leader or the PM at the time or the premier at the time brings a different lens to that. I mean, let's face it, Bob Rae changed the image of NDP here in Ontario for better or for worse. But the NDP kind of stayed where they were for all intents and purposes. So there was a structural shift there historically, and I'm not sure you can put it back now because, like you say, we're into this era of social media and personality and everything's about charisma. Not that it wasn't in the past, it didn't have some impact. But we've lost that demarcation. There is no, sort of great wall between the two of them.
Yeah, like the party today serves the leader as opposed to the members and the history and the ideas that a political party used to have. And it's been a progression towards this. This is not a rapid shift to this personalization or personalism that we see in politics, but it has effects, and it means that political parties come and go really quickly. They become popular, and then the moment their leader becomes unpopular, they're swept away, right? And we saw that in Ontario with the Liberals and McGuinty and Wynne. We see that now happening federally. We saw it to some extent with Harper and the Conservatives when he lost. And so it's so much tied to as a pollster, you don't even have to ask people how they feel about a political party anymore, because you just ask how they feel about the leader, and that's going to be basically the exact same answer they would give about the party.
Mm-hmm. So I thought it was interesting. Your latest piece of research in the newsletter, In Focus, was asking less conventional questions, rather than, what do you think about approval ratings for the leaders or the party themselves? And it was more perceptual, I guess, might be a better way to put it around it. And I love the idea that, just generally Canadians thought that Justin Trudeau would be the better party host than Pierre Poilievre. And while that might make people laugh and giggle, there's something to be said around our perceptions of the individual. And I come back to my opening point. I can't find somebody that I really want to align myself with here. And that's where I'm going to find these things, not necessarily in their policy on transportation or immigration.
Well, look, I think a lot of voting behavior is not. People will say in a poll, I vote for policy. I pick, I look at, no one carefully picks apart a party platform and says, some people vote on a specific issue and they say, look, I need this. I'm going to be a parent. Childcare is important. I'm going to look for the party that's going to deliver the best childcare plan for me. But for the vast majority of voters, they're looking at a broader feeling. If they're not a partisan, if they're not somebody who's deeply attached to a party and will always vote that way, for everybody else, leadership has become a really key driver in how we feel about a leader and what we're asking that leader to do. And so this exercise we did on this recent survey where we asked people between Trudeau and Poilievre, who do you think would be better at, you said, hosting a party or negotiating a discount or putting out a kitchen fire, right? Making Thanksgiving dinner. And these seem ridiculous in some way because no prime minister is doing any of these for us. These are all private things. But what I learned, first of all, is that Canadians actually distinguish between these. So it doesn't matter. You might think on the one hand, if you like Pierre Poilievre, you're going to say he's best on all of them. But that doesn't happen. People do distinguish. So, for example, Poilievre is much farther ahead of Trudeau on what I call like the competence and problem-solving things, right? So putting up a shelf, putting out a kitchen fire, being in charge of the map for a road trip, even though we don't really use maps. Nonetheless, that idea of I'm giving you the responsibility to get us from A to B, okay? He's winning by 20 points over Trudeau on that. Trudeau's only one he wins on is hosting a party, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what's interesting to me is actually they're basically tied on three what I call personality type scenarios. Who do you want to have a conversation with at a pub? Who do you want to sit beside on an airplane? And who do you want to look after your children while you're out? And on those, although you'd say, well, Poilievre and Trudeau being tied is bad for Trudeau, it actually is a signal that there's weakness on Poilievre's front, that people might see him as a problem solver, but they may not want to have a conversation with him. They may not actually like him. And so when I think about an election, say next year, and the choice that Canadians are going to make, right now, people feel that the kitchen's on fire and we need somebody to put it out. But if a year from now, the question tilts slightly and it's, well, who do I actually feel comfortable with? Who do I trust with the future of the country? I'm not entirely convinced. I still think Poilievre's the vast favorite to win. I'm not entirely convinced that we know the answer to that yet. But this poll maybe gives us some insight into the nuances on how people view these two leaders and how they then might evaluate them during an election, which is probably the one time where people are going to pay the most attention to them.
To me, it's two phases, though. I think there's a process here where we talk about there's a call for change. There's just this innate, okay, enough already. Boom, I'm just checking the box. Let's move on. We don't discover what you've just asked until we see the mandate develop with the next government. And that's what happened here in Ontario when Ontario said, go to hell, Kathleen Wynne, and off she went into the sunset. And Doug Ford came in, and then all of a sudden, within weeks, people are standing up. People who voted for Doug Ford say, what the hell are you doing? So there was a need for change in Ontario. Okay, now we paid attention once we got a sense of what it exactly meant to have that new government in place. I'm thinking that we're looking at the same sort of potential in Ottawa.
And again, you can like somebody or not like somebody, but if you think that, it's like medicine, I think. I always like to use that analogy, like, Buckley's taste bad, but it works kind of framing, right? And I may be somebody who may not have voted Conservative the last three elections. I may be somebody who, when I hear Pierre Poilievre I'm not entirely comfortable with the way he talks about issues or the his aggressiveness. But if I'm somebody fundamentally who believes that the current direction of the country is not sustainable, we can't keep doing this, and the Liberals don't seem to have any new ideas, or I just don't feel good that Trudeau's the guy for the moment, then you're right, change just happens. And it's always important for us to remember how, we talk percentages when we do polling, but the Conservatives don't need that much more support to win an election. They got 34, 35% of the vote in the last two elections. You get 4 or 5 points more and you're there. And they're well ahead of that right now. They're getting more than they need. But it doesn't require a lot of people to just change their mind in order for the outcome to fundamentally change.
So when we look at the top of that list, by the way, when you talked about who would you like to leave your kids with, both of them fall behind the neither. Basically. 36% saying, I don't want either one of them anywhere near my kids. And then it's about a third each for the other two. So it's interesting to look at the whole number. But the question around, hosting a party, and I get that on the surface that fits the prime minister, but when you look at what happened against the backdrop of the budget this past week, it occurs to me, he's the guy who shows up as the party host in the fancy car and the fancy clothes, but he leaves before the staff has been paid and the mess has been cleaned up.
I think that's probably a great way to describe, for a lot of people, the 8 years of his government, right? And I think when he was elected in 2015, after a number of years of Mr. Harper, who wasn't fun and you wouldn't want him hosting a party, let's just face it. I think people wanted a party in 2015, right? They wanted to feel good. They wanted celebrity. They wanted the world to know who we were again. And I think your analogy of, 8 years on of a party and we got a big mess to clean up. And so that's the nature and cyclical nature, I think, of governments and what voters are looking for that you summed up. I'm going to have to steal that there, Dave. You should write that up, or because it's such a good summation, I think, of how most people feel right now.
So, and I think it was really, not to be overly glib, but I think that was what happened in the budget. Let me take, for example, on the one hand, we've got the question around the capital gains tax, and I don't want to get down in the weeds on the actuarial numbers and all that stuff. There's one on. On the other hand, we've got the Canada Disability Benefit. If we take the messaging on both of those things, they are on brand. That is to say, we want to make sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share so that we can support those who are vulnerable. On the other hand, we've got the Canada Disability Benefit, which was promised and intended entirely to raise 1 million Canadians who live with disability out of poverty. So, go back to each one. On the capital gains, all I've heard is pushback. Now, increasing taxes is not going to be, all that popular generally, but it's clear that their messaging or their read of this is off right away, because there's a whole middle class uprise here that's happening. Hey, wait a minute! All of a sudden, you're hitting my long-term generational investments, whether it's in property or the businesses that I own or run. There's a whole question of productivity and innovation being stunted that wasn't taken into account. And there's some big voices in those complaints. On the other side of it is they end up coughing up what amounts to $200 a month for those living with disability. Ottawa now joins the ranks of other provinces and jurisdictions that have actually legislated poverty. They have now put people in a place where they are officially below the the poverty line, and they're contributing to that deficit in terms of their monthly income. They have done nothing to remotely get close to raising anybody out of poverty or even close to the poverty line. Those two things seem to be really at odds, where I'm trying to raise money to make sure that the wealthy pay their fair share to support those who need it, but the vulnerable aren't getting anywhere close to what they need on the other side of it is. This is really out of whack. Each one of them on their own is a problem for this government. But when you look at both of them, the imbalance becomes even greater than the sum of the parts.
Well, I think on the disability benefit, I think here's an example of, mean, some will argue, look, there's never been anything like this federally. This is a step in the right direction. In fact, that's what the Liberals have been saying. But it doesn't solve the problem. So why are we doing it? And I think that's a criticism that the Liberal government has often gotten, which is they'll take a step, but they won't do the step they need to do to actually deal with the thing they're trying to solve for. And it does challenge, you're right, the narrative, the brand. We're come back to brand, right? That the Liberal Party wants, and I think the Prime Minister wants people to believe, is they have your back. They're standing up for working and middle class Canadians, and they're going to do anything that they can to make it right. And I think this is an example of that not happening. And then on the side of the capital gains tax, first of all, I will say, as somebody who is often trying to understand how Canadians approach and what do they even understand about policy, the capital gains tax is probably the most complicated tax to explain to people, because they'll, 66% inclusion rate, people confuse that's the rate of tax. And the point, though, is at a moment, would have been my advice. Yes, Canadians believe the tax system is unfair. They think that the wealthy don't pay their fair share. Those are all true. On the other hand, at a time when people are feeling that money is scarce, the signal that raising taxes, even if you keep coding it in this is going to be for the rich or the wealthiest, still leaves a lot of people, and I've seen some research that came out yesterday that shows this, that people at the end of the day, when asked about this budget, still believe they will be paying more. Like 80% believe they will be paying more as a result of this budget. And that to me is a signal of just how complicated and difficult it is. So if this, and I think there's still time for this to sort of play itself out, but if in a week from now, we see that Canadians, for the most part, particularly those Canadians that this government needed to convince, young people in particular, that they have got a plan in place, if they're left with the feeling that this government has, one, as you said, basically ensured that people with disabilities do not have enough money to make to live, at all, and two, that in reality, I'm feeling more anxious about government taking my future away through taxes, then they've completely missed the boat. And I think that's why we're not going to see fundamental changes in the polls, because the problem is not the policy choices on the edge with this government. The problem is the overall story. And at some point, people do not believe that what the Prime Minister says he's trying to do matches what he's actually doing. And as long as that happens, he's never going to build back that relationship.
So if we were to lay that scenario over the politics in Ontario, for example, Doug Ford would live with that for 10 days and then come back to the media and say, okay, listen, we heard you, we'd change it. And people would criticize him for it. But to your point, okay, we get it. And as hard as it is to know exactly where he might be in terms of what lane he's picking, that would resonate with people. But you're not going to get that from the Liberals in Ottawa.
Yeah, like Doug Ford's the ultimate, he's the only A/B testing politician I've ever seen, right? Like when you, in marketing and advertising, you do research. So you try to understand, okay, if I run this ad or I run this variation, how will the audience respond? But then the best way is actually to put it in market. And if you get a lot of engagement on it, that ad's really good. And in the one that you don't run anymore. Doug Ford's basically the AB premier. He goes out and says, what, I'm going to do this. And then he gets a reaction and he's like, well, no one really likes that. Okay, then we're going to do this, right? And we released a poll again on the weekend that shows he's holding his core audience together. They're willing to forgive him. And it is a brand of politics I have never seen. And the question is, at what point do people start to say, do you have any strategy or any, does it run itself out? There's only so much forgiveness we can give somebody. But for now, I think the Prime Minister of Canada can learn a lot from the Premier of Ontario on what consumers and voters are looking for in terms of some recognition that I haven't done everything right.
A lot of the narrative in terms of driving the messaging federally has obviously been around the tax, particularly the carbon tax. And then, of course, April 1st, the carbon tax went up. And it was 3 cents, a liter generally speaking, and people, I don't think, to your point, getting down in the weeds, really appreciated that it was 3 cents on $1.50 or whatever it might have been. But, back to Ford, he offered up a master class in populist, and small p, politics the other day, because he managed to rant on the 14-cent hike at the pumps that was clearly driven by the oil companies. And then he morphed it into the criticisms around the carbon tax, blamed Trudeau and Bonnie Crombie all in the same breath. And he was able to pull that thread through without even blinking. And I thought, there's a guy who's kind of got his hand and his fingers on the pulse of what people are bitching about and worried about. A lot of that, though, has happened federally. Poilievre's coming up. He's got his bumper sticker labels, axe the tax, etc. And for the most part, that has created this momentum, I think, behind what you're talking about. But at the heart of it, they don't seem to have an alternative. Like, we don't necessarily say, okay, if you don't want the carbon tax, what is it you want to do about climate change? And what is it you want to do effectively? Do you put a price on carbon? And even if the media gets its one question, one follow-up, those questions don't get answered. And I'm not sure that resonates or concerns people generally.
I think right now, I don't think there's people out there saying, well, I don't know what Poilievre's going to do, and that's a problem. I do think that whenever the next election comes, if people I think there's some still liability and vulnerability for the Conservatives to not at least give people a sense of where I don't think they need detail. I mean, Doug Ford won in 2018 without a platform. You don't need to, in an era of change, when people want change, you're right, you don't need to detail everything. But I still think you have to make people feel confident that you care about the issue that they care about. And so right now, climate change is issue number 6. But let's say, in 2025 in October, when we might be in an election, and we come out of a summer of intense, horrible wildfires, I suspect climate change will rise on that issue. And the Conservatives need to have an answer to the question, do you care about this issue? Are you going to be engaged on it? And what are you going to do? They don't need that right now, because right now, the fire that's actually burning in most people's world is the cost of living, which is why the Premier can say what he says and why the Conservatives have been so effective at connecting the dots with people. But that could change. And so issue salience and the world is just so unpredictable that for me to say that a year and a half from now we're going to still be talking about the cost of living would be crazy to say. But it could be, but it could be some other issue that then changes the frame by which people assess the leader. So back to the host a party versus put out a fire, those things matter. Right now, I think people are looking for somebody to put out the fire. A year from now, it could be a very different question.
Just before we go, and we started on brand with the Liberals, let's just talk about sort of Ford and Poilievre, because the election cycle is very tight. It's very close in terms of Ontario and the feds. They have different brands of conservatism. There's no question they have a different approach. There's a sort of this underlying tone or sense that they don't get along, that the federal party is, not really all that comfy cozy with the provincial party. There was, I think it might have been Steve Paikin had noted that, there might be some strategy for the Ontario Conservatives to call an election earlier and run absent of the shadow of the federal Conservatives running against Trudeau in this moment of change. And it's an interesting thing because it would be unconventional because we have set dates, but we're back to the Ford brand. That's not entirely out of the question.
No, and I think there is lots of risk for the Ontario PCs that if, let's say, we go on schedule and the Conservatives win in October of 2025 and then Ontario goes to the polls in June of 2026, that 7-8 month window between, what do governments often do in the first year of their mandate? They do the unpopular things, the things like bringing out a budget that makes big cuts to spending or somebody's going to be hurting. I think Mike Harris, for example, helped save Jean Chrétien when Harris was elected in 95. And, we have to remember back then, Chrétien was doing difficult things too, wasn't as popular, but having that counterweight in Ontario federally gave Chrétien, not that he ran against Mike Harris, but it just helped make the case that, it wasn't all my fault. So I think there's some risk. And hey, that strategy of calling an early election when Justin Trudeau, if he's still leader and still as unpopular as he is, might make complete sense for the PCs. There's always risk, and you call an election when you don't need to, but I think you're right on Ford that you get blamed for calling, like think of Trudeau in 2021. But Ford has an ability just to say, well, hey, folks, now's the time to do it. I need a mandate. I need a new mandate.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wouldn't. Now that we've said it out loud, that doesn't preclude him from doing it.
It doesn't.
Right, the way it's going. David Coletto, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks, Dave.
Yes, indeed. Thanks to David Coletto, always a good guest to have on Now and Next. And thanks to you for listening. If you want to comment, follow us on the socials. You can find me at Dave Trafford, and that gets to me on, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and LinkedIn. And if you've got a thought on the Bell Media conversation I had on LinkedIn. Also, this whole issue of where are we going to find the next generation of journalists? I asked that question earlier in the week as well, because in my day, you walked into a newsroom, and at one point, you'd kind of do a head count. When I was running CFRB in Toronto, and we had upwards of 700 years of experience in that room. Now, we had a fair number of people, more than 24 folks work in that newsroom. That didn't include hosts and producers and all that kind of stuff. That was just the people in the newsroom. Don't have that anymore. So if we're actually going to have good, credible, thoughtful journalism that we all require and need to make sure things work properly, and there's some accountability out there, where do we get that next generation of journalists? I pose the question. If you've got an answer, post it on my LinkedIn page at Dave Trafford, and it'd be interesting to hear what you've got to say. All right, that'll do it for us here. This is Now and Next. It is the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network. It's great of you to join us, and come back again. Next time, we're going to talk about the need for basic guaranteed income right across Canada and the difference that it will make in stabilizing our economy, our health, our education, never mind lifting people out of poverty. That's next on Now and Next, right here for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.